Did Jesus really exist? Is there any historical evidence of Jesus Christ? Typically, when this question is asked, the person asking qualifies the question with outside of the Bible. We do not grant this idea that the Bible cannot be considered a source of evidence for the existence of Jesus. The New Testament contains hundreds of references to Jesus Christ. There are those who date the writing of the Gospels to the 2nd century A.D., more than 100 years after Jesus' death. Even if this were the case, which we strongly dispute, in terms of ancient evidence, writings less than 200 years after events took place are considered very reliable evidences. Further, the vast majority of scholars, Christian and non-Christian, will grant that the epistles of Paul, at least some of them, were in fact written by Paul in the middle of the 1st century A.D., less than 40 years after Jesus' death. In terms of ancient manuscript evidence, this is extraordinarily strong proof of the existence of a man named Jesus in Israel in the early 1st century A.D. It is also important to recognize that in A.D. 70, the Romans invaded and destroyed Jerusalem and most of Israel, slaughtering its inhabitants. Entire cities were literally burned to the ground. We should not be surprised, then, if much evidence of Jesus' existence was destroyed. Many of the eyewitnesses of Jesus would have been killed. These facts likely limited the amount of surviving eyewitness testimony of Jesus. Considering that Jesus' ministry was largely confined to a relatively unimportant area in a small corridor of the Roman Empire, a surprising amount of information about Jesus can be drawn from secular historical sources. Some of the more important historical evidences of Jesus include these. The 1st century Roman Tacitus, who was considered one of the more accurate historians of the ancient world, mentioned superstitious Christians, from Christus, which is Latin for Christ, who suffered under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Suetonius, chief secretary to Emperor Hadrian, wrote that there was a man named Chrestus, or Christ, who lived during the 1st century. Flavius Josephus is the most famous Jewish historian. In his Antiquities, he refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. There is a controversial verse in the Antiquities that says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him." One version reads, "At this time there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Julius Africanus quotes the historian Thallus in a discussion of the darkness which followed the crucifixion of Christ. Pliny the Younger, in Letters 10, verse 96, recorded early Christian worship practices, including the fact that Christians worshiped Jesus as God and were very ethical, and he includes a reference to the love feast and the Lord's Supper. The Babylonian Talmud confirms Jesus' crucifixion on the eve of Passover, and the accusations against Christ of practicing sorcery and encouraging Jewish apostasy. Lucian of Samosata was a 2nd century Greek writer who admits that Jesus was worshipped by Christians, introduced new teachings, and was crucified for them. He said that Jesus' teachings included the brotherhood of all believers, the importance of conversion, and the importance of denying other gods. Christians lived according to Jesus' laws, believed themselves to be immortal, and were characterized by contempt for death, voluntary self-devotion, and renunciation of material goods. Mara bar Serapion confirms that Jesus was thought to be a wise and virtuous man, was considered by many to be the king of Israel, and was put to death by the Jews, and lived on in the teachings of his followers. Then we have all the Gnostic writings, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Treatise on Resurrection, etc., that all mention Jesus. In fact, we can almost reconstruct the Gospel just from early non-Christian sources. Jesus was called the Christ, did magic, led Israel into new teachings, and was hanged on Passover for them, in Judea, but claimed to be God and would return, which his followers believed, worshiping him as God. There is overwhelming evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, both in secular and biblical history. Perhaps the greatest evidence that Jesus did exist is the fact that literally thousands of Christians in the 1st century AD, including the 12 apostles, were willing to give their lives as martyrs for Jesus Christ. People will die for what they believe to be true, but no one will die for what they know to be a lie.